Okay, the meeting is being recorded. We'll jump to a different view here in just a second. My name's Peter Smallage. I'm the New York State Extension Forester, and I want to welcome you. Glad that you're willing and able to participate. Before we get going, anyone who is interested in continuing ed credits, if you could just quickly click the link that you see on the left center of your screen. It's the surveys.cit.cornell link. This is only for people who are participating as a live, let me rephrase that, who are participating in the live version of this webinar. Because it's recorded, when you come back and watch the recording, you'll be able to access that survey link, but that doesn't count. So, but if you click that now, it'll open up a page on your web browser and you can complete that later. Okay, going to jump to the presentation. While I'm doing that, and while that's loading, well, there we go. What I'd like everyone to do, the way that we're going to interact during the webinar, and those of you who have been here are familiar with this, and if you haven't, then I want you to learn. The chat pod, which is now located in the left center of your screen, has a white rectangular box at the bottom where you can type a message and then just press enter on your keyboard, and it will send the message to that chat pod where I can read it and respond to it. I'll give an audio response rather than trying to type a response. You can also send private messages amongst yourselves. I would, if you have questions, my preference is for you to go ahead and submit the question so that everyone can see it, and then that way it's on record, and I don't have to repeat the question. Okay, so today we're going to be talking about the response of invasive and interfering shrubs and trees to flame control. Flame weeding has been historically used as an organic weed management technique for agricultural applications, and it was one that I started dabbling with about 5 years ago after reading an article. One Saturday morning I was sitting at home and looking in a magazine of the Northeast Farming, and I saw that flame weeding had been approved as an organic control in agriculture, and I thought, hey, I bet I can do that, use that in the woods to kill trees and plants that I don't like. So I started off on a shoestring budget, and the picture in the upper left-hand corner was one of the earlier starts, where I just took the propane tank from my barbecue grill and hooked it up to a flame wand, and I was working there with Paul Osborne at the Genesee County Park near Bethany. So there are questions coming in. Please use those questions, and I'll be referring back to those periodically. Nick talks about using the backpack version, and I'll show that backpack version and have a link for that. I agree. You don't want to have to carry those tanks around by hand. Seed dispersal, the flame weeding itself, in regards to Carl's question, flame weeding does not specifically increase seed dispersal. You have the potential of creating openings in the canopy that add sunlight that can change germination opportunities of those species. So before we get going, I want to make some acknowledgments. Cornell University has fully and singly funded this research through the cooperative extension system, doing the outreach component in the Cornell University Ag Experiment Station. I've had great conversations and partnerships with colleagues at the University of Connecticut, and have had a lot of fun with research and extension collaborators. So my appreciation to them, these research and extension collaborators have either provided a site where I've gone and torched some of their invasive or interfering plants, or they've hosted extension workshops. And then finally, I've had several students involved in working on this over the last couple of years. I neglected to include Janine Moy, who was the first student that worked on this. Okay, so what are the issues with invasive and interfering shrubs? My guess is those of you who are participating have clearly identified what those issues already are from your perspective. So I don't need to go into a lot of details with these, but they relate to things such as reduced biodiversity, inhibiting regeneration, impeding access, reducing productivity, just generally increasing the costs of management are all some common ones that come to mind. The University of Connecticut, in their work, Tom and Jeff and Scott found that when they controlled barberry, they controlled the habitat for the deer mice that occurred in those areas that were barberry dominated. By controlling the habitat for deer mice, they made presumably predation better, and the numbers of deer mice decreased, and the numbers of ticks, deer ticks that carry Lyme disease, decreased, and so actually flame weeding of barberry resulted in an improvement of human health. I should mention that the title here is invasive and interfering. Invasive in New York at least has a very specific definition that includes exotic species. Interfering is a more general term which just refers to a plant species that interferes with our ability to achieve whatever our stated management objective might be, and it would include both invasive and native species. So one of the ways to look at vegetation management techniques, and flame weeding falls under that category of vegetation management, is to break it up in both mode and method. And so the mode refers to whether the treatments are selective or broadcast, and the method refers to whether or not or how it's applied. So it's either a physical mechanical disruption, it's a chemical disruption, or it's a biological disruption. So flame would typically fall in the selective physical or selective mechanical category. You can see examples of some other strategies that are used in other combinations of mode and method. All of these different vegetation management techniques have advantages and disadvantages. The selective mechanical techniques where flame weeding would fall, the advantages that it brings are that it tends to be very target specific and has, I'll say, limited site disturbance. Now I'll give you some descriptions in a few minutes where you can find where you don't have such limited site disturbance. The disadvantages of these, and again focusing in on flame weeding, is that it tends to be most efficient on selective mechanical if you have relatively low abundance of organisms that you're trying to treat. And by selective, it means that you can pinpoint an individual plant or an individual organism and apply whatever treatment you want to that particular organism. It doesn't usually work particularly well with plants that sprout, and it tends to have fairly high labor costs, especially as the number of plants that you're treating goes up. And you can see the other advantages and disadvantages. And for those of you that came in at the last minute, and I'll post it when we get to the end, I have some downloadable files that you can access this particular PowerPoint as a handout. I see a question from Ron for the University of Connecticut study. I do believe that's available. I'll send a note to Jeff Ward and see if that's been published, and then send that out to the webinar listserv. Okay, so why do we want to think about using flame weeding to manage undesirable woody plants? And that's all of my work is focused on woody plants. First, there's proven effectiveness. There's decades of agricultural research that's documented the effectiveness of flame weeding, that mostly on herbaceous plants. Flame weeding was common, and perhaps the most common vegetation management technique in agriculture prior to World War II. technological advances with petroleum-based chemicals and herbicides developed as about the time of World War II, and the herbicide technology has gained more popularity than some of these, more frequent use than the organic techniques. There's been woody plant research done both at Cornell and the University of Connecticut, and I think the University of Maine did some a few years back. They've proven effective, and so that's why this is something that's worth considering. The technology tends to be fairly low cost. You can buy a complete outfit, if you will, for about $250 to $300. They're fairly accessible. Unlike pesticide certification, you're not required to take, to be certified. They're fairly user friendly, and some people like them specifically because they're organic. It's a non-chemical approach, and one of the motivations in Connecticut is that some of the, if not all of the watersheds in Connecticut prohibit the use of, municipal watersheds prohibit the use of herbicides, and so things like flame weeding or manual cutting or pulling are the only techniques that are available to them. Chris talks about sprouting plants. We'll get to that in a little bit, Chris. So if I don't mention it sufficiently, then you can bring that up again. The objectives that I want to cover today and that I've been working on this project are twofold. One is to evaluate the response of common species to flame weeding. I knew that the University of Connecticut was working with barberry. They had a couple of years head start, and so they were focusing in depth on one species, and I wanted to do a broader review of how a variety of different species responded. And then as part of that, to develop extension education materials. So this is, I wanted to start off by just making sure everybody could visualize what I'm talking about when I talk about flame weeding. This was a picture taken during a workshop at Bill LaPointe's woodlot in St. Lawrence County, and I think that was it was either August last year or August in 2008, and it illustrates a few things. It illustrates, here's I took a volunteer from the audience, and he's flaming. This is a buckthorn tree, and this is Bill LaPointe's most common invasive plant, and so it shows flaming the bottom of the tree, and the way the flame works is a physical girdling of the stem to prevent or to disconnect the roots from the foliage. The intent is to try and provide enough burn and enough heat at ground level to hopefully kill some of that root crown and reduce the ability of the plant to sprout. Carl raises the question about safety. I have a handout on safety that's a downloadable file that I'll bring up in a few minutes, and I thought we'd do a little group activity. I want you all to look at this. There are a number of safety features that are part of this picture, and so I want you to look at those safety features, count how many you see, and then I'll bring this over, and you can start voting once you look at those. Count how many you see, and then you can select the number of safety features that you see. So we're going to do this quickly. We're not going to wait for everyone to vote. I don't usually do these polls, but I thought it would be a fun activity. Okay, so it looks like the voting has slowed down. Have the majority of participants thinking that there are 2 or 3. I'm going to close the poll now. 50% say 2 or 3. Fortunately, that's not the right answer, but that's the most popular answer. So here's one safety feature. I'm standing, that's me in the background with the red shirt on. I'm carrying a water tank to make sure things don't get out of control. The flame operator is wearing safety glasses. Oftentimes you'll get blowback of embers or updraft from the heat that will blow those embers into your eyes. So that's 2. Depending upon how you want to count them, long pants and boots would be 3 or 3 and 4. And then one that's specific to this particular situation is prior to the group arriving, we pretty aggressively raked the leaf litter away. This was for 2 reasons. One, it was in August, so the leaf litter was very dry. And secondly, it was a demonstration. There was, what you can't see from this picture, is a group of about 30 or 40 people, and I didn't want to deal with a ground fire in a group of people. Dan asks about his gloves. Gloves would be another consideration as a safety feature. Some people like them, some don't. There's really not there's not an essential need for gloves, so long as you remember you don't want there's one end of the flame torch that you can touch, and there's one end of the flame torch you do not want to touch. Just some other pictures to help you visualize flame weeding. Here's the same group. Again, same picture from a different angle. You can see he's holding the flame torch about 20 inches away from the base of the tree. Here's Bill LaPointe, the owner of the property. We did some, as I'll talk about with the research in just a few minutes, we had a series of experiments that involved dormant season burning as well as growing season burning. And you can see that I've graduated up to having a backpack configuration. The hose, you can see the orange hose in the picture that connects the flame wand or the torch to the tank. Sally asked about having 2 people, if not in winter. You need to be very prudent about having access to water. I always had, in all of my flame work, we always had one person with a water tank and another person with the torch and propane. So, except in situations as you see in this particular picture. If you went out, you could use this conceivably during a rain event, or after a very heavy rain. You could conceivably gamble in a situation like that. I think I would still want to have a water tank nearby, but maybe I wouldn't need to have a second person. Then here's a picture. That's a good segue. Here's a picture I'm with one of my research collaborators, Ron Peterson, and this was some flame work we were doing on multiflora rose. These are some of our research samples flagged before we put in the wooden stakes. And you can imagine this, the ground cover here, this would have been in maybe early April, maybe late April that particular year. Was very dry. We actually ended up having a bit more excitement than I enjoy having when we do flame work. So I was glad at that particular time to have a water tank handy. Okay, so now let's look at some ecological characteristics of the species that I worked with as flame subjects. Bush honeysuckle was one of those. There are 3 different invasive species of the bush honeysuckle variety, Amur, Morrow's, and Tarshan honeysuckle. All of them are common throughout the Northeast. A point of caution, though, is that there are also 3 different genera of honeysuckle that are native. And as applies to all vegetation management, it's essential that you know the species that you're working with. Just because you know a common name and you can call it honeysuckle doesn't mean that it's one that you should necessarily try to control. Honeysuckle is identical essentially to all of the invasive plants that I'll be talking about here, and maybe many of them in general. These are all largely self-inflicted problems. We introduced all of these species for a number of different reasons. Oftentimes in the mid to late 1800s, honeysuckle was introduced for horticultural and for wildlife reasons. Some of its characteristics are that it tends to push out its foliage early in the year and retain that foliage late in the year. Um, it's advantageous that it doesn't tend to flower until it tends to be 5 or 8 years old. That gives us as managers and owners a bit of a window. If we start to see some plants appearing in our fields or in our woodlands, we have a few years to develop a strategy. However, we want to get to that fairly quickly because you can see an individual bush honeysuckle can produce as many as 20,000 flowers per plant, and each flower can have up to 6 seeds per flower. So an individual plant may push out 100,000 seeds per plant in a given year. Even if that has a 1% success rate, that's a lot of plants coming into your particular habitats. Bush honeysuckle is not known to produce a seed bank. One of the problems, or two of the problems with honeysuckle, these bush honeysuckles, is that the fruit tends to be low in fat content. The birds that do consume those seeds are then acquiring a low quality nutrition. They're feeding on these, particularly the neotropical migrants, and leaving on their international journeys to warmer climates with a substandard nutritional base. Many of these invasive shrubs also have documented higher rates of nest predation by possums and squirrels and skunks, or not squirrels, possums and raccoons and skunks. Maybe there are some squirrels that predate nests. Higher nest predation in these invasive shrubs than in native shrubs. Janine wants to know if the flame weeding could be used for stream plants. The key is that I think you need to be able to get pretty close to the root system. So if the roots are underwater, maybe you could hit them when they are when the stream is low in the spring or late winter. Some more on bush honeysuckle. On the mechanical side, there are options to, as you can see in the left, we have a group of students here that are grubbing them out. Many of the shrub species, invasive shrubs, tend to be shallow rooted and relatively easily extracted. There are also tools that are available. You see in the upper right hand corner there's a tool called a root wrench, and then here we have an example of flame weeding during one of our demonstrations. Okay, we'll get to, we got some comments. So squirrels and snakes, okay, true. Emily, as nest predators, Emily talks about carpets of buckthorn seedlings. The flame weeding, as you can see in this picture, in the pictures I've shown, tend to be more on the order of selective than on broadcast. So I've never worked with it. The agricultural technologies would be more applicable to buckthorn seedlings, where you have maybe a broad flame head, but I've not done work with those. Okay, we've talked about the mechanical options. There are some chemical options as well. Easy-Ject is a way to inject a chemical into the stem. Some applications, foliar applications with glyphosate on stems that are less than 4.5 feet tall, or using cut stump treatments on stems when they tend to be a bit taller. Autumn olive, again, this is one we introduced. A species that's common to shrubs, or shrub that's common to fields and open woods. In the background of the upper picture, you see these fields with these little specks that are examples of autumn olive, and then in the picture in the lower right, you see these large shrub-dominated communities. These are the types of shrub communities that are sought after, for example, on rights of ways because they exclude trees and they tend to be very stable. But those communities also are a significant source of seed to spread into local environments. Again, options fairly similar on autumn olive as for bush honeysuckle. Hand pulling works pretty well. Flame, I'll share those research numbers with you in a minute, and then there are some chemical treatments that work too. Multiflora rose, this may be one of the most common species that people love to hate. Also brought in the mid-1800s for a number of different reasons. Some new ones here as a living fence and as rootstock. It's reported to be able to root from branch tips, although I've not personally observed that. And there are a number of different control mechanisms that are available. Buckthorn is one we were talking about earlier. Common, I've seen it most commonly in New York, at least north of Syracuse, kind of in the counties that ring the Adirondacks, along the Lake Plains and St. Lawrence valleys. It was introduced as well, common in fields and forest understories. There are some reports that it may be controlled with prescribed fire, although it does have a propensity to sprout. So I'm not convinced that the prescribed fire, how effective that would be. It, like the others, is shallow rooted. On my woodlot that my wife and I own in the Adirondacks, we have a number of smaller plants. We've taught our daughters how to identify the sub-opposite leaf arrangement and the arcuate venation of the leaves, and encourage them to pull those plants when they find them. On the native species side, I've worked with striped maple. It's very shade tolerant, can form a dense understory like the shrubs can, and like most of those shrubs, tends to be of very low preference for deer browsing. American beech is the second native species I worked with, also very tolerant of shade. It has the added feature that it's able to reproduce vegetatively from roots and form dense thickets. One of the precipitating problems with American beech is the beech bark disease or beech bark decline. It's a combination of a scale and a fungus. You can see the aftermath of the fungus in this upper picture. The fungus will ultimately kill American beech. Very low rates of resistance in the species. Trying to find ways to control that. Herbicides are perhaps the most effective technique, but we've done some work with flame weeding as well. So the landowner's perspective, so that's an introduction to the species. The landowner's perspective is essential. They need to understand and evaluate the extent to which a problem exists, and typically work with their land manager, professional foresters, or other land managers to measure and objectively describe the problem and the desired outcome. So they need to know what's the problem and what's the outcome that we want. Do we want to have 50% control? Do we want to have 80% control? Do we want the control to last for 1 year or 2 years, or do we want this control to be more permanent? Typically what's not attainable is 100% control for a long period of time. There's just too much influence from neighboring properties that can serve as a source for incoming propagules to think that we're going to have 100% control for a long period of time. But we may have enough control so that we can establish the next forest or other species, desirable species, that are able to be competitive with the influx, reintroduction of invasives. Landowners need to look at the resources that they have for management and their willingness to apply different types of tools. Okay, so what were the research questions that I was looking at? The first question related to beech is whether or not flame treatment will kill beech, and if the duration of flame weeding is an important consideration. When I was first working with flame weeding, it seemed to me that the duration of the flame would be an essential question because it would directly relate to the economics of this as a technique. The longer the flame was active, the more propane you're using, the increased cost, the increased allocation of time. I've since downplayed or actually abandoned questions related to duration as I've looked at other types of questions. A second question related to the shrub species, and this would include striped maple, is whether or not flame treatments needed to occur during the dormant and or growing season. The work that the University of Connecticut had done found maximum effectiveness with 2 flame treatments, both happening early in the growing season. So one flame treatment would happen shortly after leaf out, and then a second flame treatment would happen about 6 months earlier. This provides a fairly narrow window of opportunity if you're going to work immediately after leaf out. And the logic or the theory behind this is that as plants leaf out, they've significantly depleted their starch reserves in their root system, pushed out those leaves, come in and flame the plant, which girdles it. The plant will be expected to send out root crown suckers or stem suckers from below the area where the plant was flamed in response to that disturbance. And then you come back about 6 weeks later and flame it again. But that's a narrow window, so I wanted to know, could we do the initial flame during the dormant season? And I showed you some pictures of that earlier. And then that second flame event happening during the growing season. Okay, Janine, I'll get to the duration here in just a minute. And then the third question was whether or not late summer treatments would work. And this we rather stumbled on. One of the students that was working with me was doing a kind of a sideline project and did some flame work in late summer. So we incorporated that the following year into our research program. Methodologically, the beech treatments were all done in 2005. That was our starting point. I was concerned that there would be basically just the flame weeding would result in increased root suckering of beech, and so I didn't pursue that work subsequent to 2005. But I did, and I will show the results of that. And I didn't take precise measurements on suckering, but did not see a proliferation of suckering. The shrub work was done flaming at ground level for the full circumference. You can see that in the top picture. In 2008, we used either double flame events. So we had one flame event either in the dormant season followed by a growing season flame, or both flame events happened after leaf out. And then the other option for flame treatments was a single flame event. So we'll be, keep in mind when I talk about beech, that was a single event that occurred in June of 2005. And then the shrub treatments were double treatments unless they're specified as a single August flame. Okay, more on methods. The average duration on beech, we averaged about 15 seconds on beech. And then on the shrubs, we averaged about 50 seconds for 2 individual times. So that would be a total of 110 seconds on the shrubs. My logic on the shrubs was I wanted to make sure that if flame weeding did not work as a technique, that it failed not because the duration was inadequate. We could go back and tinker with the duration after the fact, but I wanted to make sure that if we're going to find this technique as a success or a failure, to eliminate that as one of the possible reasons why it failed. Keep in mind the flame that you're working with is on the order of 1,500 to 2,000 seconds. 50 seconds on a particular shrub is more than enough time to scorch and cook the cambium, that's the cells that are underneath the bark that are the living part of that shrub. On all of the plants we took consistent measures of vigor, treated the clump, and then remeasured sprouting potential 1 year after the treatment. So most of the flame work was done in 2008. We went back and then in 2009 and took those measurements. There is a safety and equipment handout, and I'll bring that was on the website earlier, and I'll bring it up when we get to the end. Emily, yes, I said 1500 to 2000 degrees Fahrenheit. That's based on reports from the manufacturers. I've not directly measured that. Okay, so what are the results that we found? With multiflora rose, the first question that we look at, and with all of these species, we look at the percent mortality of the treated stems. Now keep in mind, we're working with this flame that's over 1500 to 2000 degrees. We would expect there to be a high level of mortality on the stems that are treated. The second slide that I'm going to show you relates to the mortality or the capacity of this particular species to sprout. On the left-hand side of the screen, the yellow arrow, that bar indicates the mortality of multiflora rose that was treated once during the dormant season and then once during the growing season. And that had about a 90% mortality of those stems. The green bar, the second from the left, slightly more than 90% mortality, would be both treatments happening after leaf out. The black bars, bar number 3 from the left and bar number 5 from the left, are controls. And then the blue crosshatched is the August flame event. So, not surprisingly, you take a fairly small and delicate stem, such as multiflora rose, and you cook it for 50 seconds once or twice, and you're going to kill it. But what we found is that multiflora rose with either 2 treatments or with a single treatment still had very high levels of resprouting capacity. And my intent with this particular research project was not to do integrated treatments, and somebody talked about, I think somebody mentioned integrated treatments where you would flame and then follow up, or just use continuously repeated flame treatments going back every month and a half or so for the duration of the growing season, and trying to deplete those starch reserves that are in the roots and allow it to keep sprouting. I was interested in looking at this in a context that I thought would be most commonly applied by woodland owners and land managers. We know from research with land managers, the most limiting constraint they have on their activities, woodland owner activities, is the time they have to invest. So this is not to say that you could not use these flame events, essentially top kill the multiflora rose, allow it to sprout back as a smaller clump, and then come in and use some other kind of vegetation management technique on it, such as a foliar application of an herbicide. But by and large, I do not recommend just flame weeding as a single or a double event for multiflora rose. Autumn olive, similar kinds of mortality regardless of whether it was before and after leaf out, as the yellow shows, or both treatments after leaf out or an August flame. We had very high mortality of the treated clumps, and we tended to have a limited amount of resprouting after 12 months. We see 40 to 50% of the spring and dormant season treated stumps sprouted, but only 20% of the autumn olive that were treated in August resprouted. So I think that the flame weeding is a good option for control of autumn olive if you can, if you're content with the 20% resprout rate, which would be the equivalent of an 80% mortality rate. Okay, we have a couple of questions. Carl asks about studies with Japanese knotweed or mile a minute. I did a project with an extension event with Stephanie Malozzi, who's with Extension down in Dutchess County, Cornell Cooperative Extension in Dutchess County, and mile a minute as a vine all of the vines, it's the challenge is being able to effectively know where the rooting system is. I don't have research data to back this up, but on the vines, I don't feel like flame weeding is going to be your best option. I have not done any work with Japanese knotweed. I would be surprised if flame weeding worked on Japanese knotweed. Peter wants to know about the duration of treatments with one tank. The longest I worked with one tank was for an afternoon, and that was in the wintertime, and so I was melting snow and ice around the plant before I then went in and treated the plant. So one tank would and those were, I think, 11-pound propane tanks. You would get at least a few hours of work out of those individual tanks. Okay, so autumn olive, we feel good about. I feel good about, particularly using in August a single flame event in August. Bush honeysuckle, here I did not do the August flame treatment, so I show both the mortality on the left, very high levels of mortality for bush honeysuckle, and very low levels of resprouting. In fact, some of the lowest levels of resprouting were measured with these bush honeysuckles. Although we didn't explicitly experiment with bush honeysuckle during August treatments, we have done several bush honeysuckles during August extension events and found those to be fairly responsive and with limited resprouting in August. So I would, I'd want to, if this is something that's, if bush honeysuckle is one of the plants you love to hate, I would do some pilot testing in August and see about its sprouting potential, where you went whole scale on that. I can't imagine though it would be any worse, if whether maybe it would require you to do a double flame event, once in August and once in September. Okay, with buckthorn, percent mortality of the treated clumps, we had about the poorest response of buckthorn. We averaged about 63% mortality of the treated stems. Part of that was because we had a range of diameters with buckthorn. We worked with buckthorn that were 1/2 inch in diameter up to buckthorn that were 6 inches in diameter. And I'll show a slide in a minute that shows that the bigger the trees, the less responsive they are to flame weeding. The second cluster of bars looks at the percentage of stems that were rated as dead that resprouted. So there was fairly good resprouting. We had 40% of the buckthorn that were treated during the dormant season, and then again in the growing season resprouted, and about 65% of the stems that died with the double flame event during the growing season resprouted. The final set of bars is I guess, the final answer, if you will, in anywhere from 70 to 80% of buckthorn that were part of this study had some evidence of life a year after the initial treatment. So buckthorn is a species that I don't think is a good option for flame weeding by itself. Now we'll talk about some integrated techniques as we close this session out. Ray asked about Chinese tallow down south. I'm not familiar with Chinese tallow, so I'm not in a position to offer any advice on that. I'm sorry, Ray. Striped maple. Same basic configuration of graph as we had for buckthorn. A slightly better mortality, but still not great, about 70% mortality of the original stems. Relatively low resprouting of dead stems that were rated as dead, but in the final analysis we ended up with 40 to 50%, so 40 to almost half of, or slightly more than half of the stems that were part of the study had some evidence of life afterwards. Now you can, in interpreting these data is important I can give an interpretation and say, as I will, that striped maple is marginally responsive to flame. Now, you may have landowner objectives that have, that where you can say, okay, I want to have 40 or 50% control, and you can look at the first set of graphs and say we killed 70% of this intermediate vegetation layer, this low layer, using flame weeding, and only 10 to 20 or 10 to 30% of those resprouted. That may be adequate for what your ownership objectives are. For somebody that wants a longer term control, flame weeding may not be your best option. Okay, here's the effect of diameter on stem response, looking at striped maple and buckthorn. You can see that the mortality of the smaller stems, those that were less than 1 inch, DBH is diameter at breast height, those that were less than 1 inch had fairly high levels of control, about 80% control. The 2-inch diameter class, buckthorn, still had 70% control, but a very significant decline in mortality for striped maple. We had essentially no mortality for striped maple larger than 3 inches, and only about 30% mortality in buckthorn that were greater than inches. Chris is asking about barberry. What I remember of the work that was done by Connecticut was that they had about 90% effectiveness using flame weeding. The bigger the clumps, the lower the effectiveness was. And as I mentioned, I'll talk to my friends and colleagues at the University of Connecticut and see if they have a copy of their report that's available, and then provide information on that to the webinar listserv. Craig, let's talk about ailanthus in a few minutes. Okay, here's the work that I did on beech flame response, and this work was mostly done through in 2005. I was working at the Genesee County Park in Bethany with Craig Vollmer and Paul Osborne. And here I used 2 different durations of flame treatment. And the legend shows a D plus 2 times D and a D plus 4 times D. That's fairly confusing, cryptic code, but basically what it means is that I had 1 second, and trees were randomly assigned to either a control where they had no flame, or a 2 times diameter or 4 times diameter. So the base number was, and that's actually incorrect, it should be 4 plus 2 times and 4 plus 4 times. So every plant got 4 seconds, and then either 2 times or 4 times the diameter. So a 3-inch diameter stem that was in the blue bar would be 2 times 3 is 6, plus 4 is 10. Or if that 3-inch stem was in the gold color, it would be 4 times 3 is 12, plus 4 is 16. On average, we were between 10 and 20 seconds duration. We looked for, a year later, we went in and looked at the percentage of the stem that had live cambium in the area where the burn occurred. 90% of the control plants had evidence of live cambium. None of the flamed plants had evidence of live cambium. We're using this because in that first year following the flame treatment, the majority of plants still had foliage. In fact, even in the second year following treatment, you can see that all of the plants had 85 to 95% of the plants, whether the control or treated, had foliage present 2 years after the flame event. So I was getting pretty discouraged at this point, as were my collaborators, looking at these plants and thinking beech doesn't know when it's dead. And by the second year afterwards, the bark where we had flamed had all fallen off, and it had exposed bare wood in the area where the flaming had occurred. And in some of those, the wood had checked because of dryness, and there was fungi that was starting to grow from those checks. So by all reasonable senses of logic, we would have expected these plants the treated plants to have been dead when in fact they still had foliage. It wasn't until after the third year we went back, and what had happened between the second and third year in the wintertime, there was a heavy snow event, and the majority of those plants that had foliage and that appeared to be alive during 2 years after the flame event, those had snapped at the point where the flame event had occurred. The wood was weak and started to rot, and so we could effectively say after that third year that we had only 30% survival of beech that had been flamed. And there was no effect of duration on the response of those plants. So that's why when I look back at the duration of time that we spent, the 2 times 50 seconds on average with the shrub plants, I think that's an excessive amount of time that's not necessary in order to control the plants. Okay, Janine's asking about, well, Emily says, Emily's describing an integrated technique, kind of a double physical selective, where you cut it, let it sprout, and then flame the sprouts. I think that's what she's describing. That would probably work. Essentially the flame weeding, all the flame weeding is doing is girdling or separating the top of the plant from the root system. So that would likely have a similar effect, although I did not experiment with that. Ginny wants to know if it's safe to use the plant material for soil enrichment. We didn't remove any of the dead plant material. It is there's no additives other than flames, so it's as safe as if the plant, I think, had died through other natural causes. Okay, so as we wrap this up here, what are some of the conclusions we can reach? First, flame weeding was effective for some species. Summer flame weeding required less labor, and in some cases, particularly with species such as autumn olive, tends to be the most effective technique. The larger the stems, particularly the trees, the less affected they are by flame. The thickness of the bark seems to be an important factor. It may also be that those bigger trees just have more reserves and are less responsive to the flame. The flame does do a fair amount of damage to the stem. They become infected with a variety of fungi, so it doesn't give you the instant gratification that you like. An instant, in this case, is 12 months later. So many of those plants, we may have a higher level of mortality than what I've been reporting here. There's a fair amount of literature that looks at different techniques in controlling these woodland invasive shrubs that describe the importance of sunlight at the surface of the crown, the shrub crown, and its ability to resprout. The greater the shading on these plants, the more likely they are to be responsive. This is an issue particularly for these study results because the autumn olive and the multiflora rose were, all of those treatments, or the majority of those treatments, were in full sunlight or nearly full sunlight, so those would have had the highest level of resprouting capacity. So it may be that multiflora rose, if you're treating multiflora rose in a woodland condition where the canopy is shading the treated plants, you're going to have a lesser amount of resprouting. There was such vigorous resprouting that when multiflora rose, I'm not particularly confident. With the bush honeysuckle, those plants were treated in a fairly dense hedge, and so the area that was treated was shaded by the surrounding bush honeysuckle. So that the shading on those plants may have limited the amount of resprouting that was possible by the bush honeysuckle. If you worked with bush honeysuckle, there were isolated clumps in the middle of a field, you may have a higher level of resprouting capacity. I don't think that flame treatments, and you saw the configuration with the backpack and the flame wand and the tubing, that doesn't seem to me to be particularly feasible in some of these very dense shrub communities. You may want to try it before you go, wholesale into this, but it just logistically seems to be a bit of a challenge. Integrated vegetation management, or blending together of techniques from a number of different modes and methods, has a lot of potential in enhancing the effectiveness of flame weeding. And an example I use here, for some people where herbicides are acceptable or feasible, it may be that you have, instead of having a multiflora rose that's the size of a small car, if you did a foliar herbicide treatment that would take a fair amount of chemical, have a greater probability that you would get some drift of that spray onto desired species, you could conceivably use flame weeding to reduce the effective size of that multiflora rose, flame it, let it die back and resprout. Then you'd have a much smaller, a bushel basket size crown that you could spray with more minimal use of herbicides. And then the final point I bring up is about pyromaniacs, and I say this because Jeff Ward in Connecticut was, in his report, he reports that flame weeding is as cost effective or as costly as the use of herbicides if you don't have to pay for labor. And so I asked him what he meant by that, and he said, for some of these, watersheds or municipal watersheds where they have user groups that have essentially adopted the watershed, or they have a nature preserve where they have a staff of volunteers, there's always one person in the crowd that's a latent pyromaniac, and if you give them a torch and give them the authority to go out and flame some of these plants, they're happy to work for free. So I include that as a consideration for you, particularly land managers and preserve managers who are thinking about different strategies that you can use. Okay, so specifically, how do we manage some of these different species? And these recommendations are based strictly on the research that I conducted. So they're not recommendations that are based on enhancing flame weeding through integrated vegetation management. Multiflora rose, I'd say it's not worth it. Maximum control we had was 20% mortality. Autumn olive, I think it's a great tool. We had 80% mortality, and that was with a single August flame event. So if autumn olive is your beast, I'd say flame weeding is an option for you. Similarly, bush honeysuckle, we had 80 to 90% mortality. The season of flame, this would have been the double flame treatments, didn't seem to matter, and I would guess that bush honeysuckle would be fairly responsive to August flaming or late summer flaming as a single event, although I didn't actually experiment with that. On the tree side, buckthorn, I would rate this as poorly effective. We had a mortality of about 20 to 30% of the stems, and it was equally bad regardless of the season. Buckthorn just has a huge potential to resprout. So you may need to try some integrated vegetation techniques, or if you have people that are willing to spend the time, I suspect if you went back and reflamed, did 3 flame events or 4 flame events, then you might be able to pull it off. Slightly more effective, flaming was slightly more effective with striped maple, roughly 50 to 60% mortality. When I say dead, that means there was either the original treated stem was dead, and or it lacked sprouting. So sprouts were considered life. The best flame treatments tended to be where both of them happened during the growing season, but the success was most restricted to the smaller diameter classes. Then with American beech, the flame duration doesn't matter. I think that logic applies back to the other species that we worked with. I don't think you need to flame it as long as we did that 50-second duration twice over. But those stems took several years before they died. Okay, so now I want to, here are some links, and I put these up, and these links are available in a website. I'm sorry, they're available in a PDF, and I'll put that up as a downloadable PDF in just a second. But I wanted to call your attention, both forestry suppliers and Red Dragon Flame Engineering offer the kit, if you will, as a backpack. I think slightly less expensive at forestry suppliers than Red Dragon, but this is Red Dragon's business, and so if you're really into it, then this is an option for you. You can also get just the flame torch head if you want, and somebody was, I think, pointing this out at Northern Tool, or I get mine at Harbor Freight. And then on the management and ecology side, there are a number of resources that are available for fact sheets that help explain the ecology of these different species, including species that I didn't mention, and management guidelines as well. Okay, so let's we're going to start taking questions. Let me do some configurations of stuff here. So there's those. So here is the exit survey. I'd very much appreciate it if everyone would participate in the exit survey. What do we need here? We want chat pod 3. And we want the file share pod. Okay, actually, so let me explain what we're seeing here. We have the file share pod. You can download the safety fact sheet, you can download the equipment fact sheet, and then you can download a copy of this PowerPoint that has all of the graphs. And so to do that, you just click on the name of the file. So you'd click on the name safety considerations, for example, and then once you click on that, you have the option to save to my computer. The chat pod 3 is where you can request documentation for continuing education, and then the exit survey is where I'd like you to go and give me some feedback so that I can document my investments of time and Cornell's investment of resources. Okay, so while you're doing that, I will scroll backwards and find where I left off with questions. All right, Craig asks about Ailanthus, also known as Tree of Heaven. Ailanthus has, I've not worked explicitly with Ailanthus. My sense is that Ailanthus has, I do recognize Ailanthus as, particularly in high sunlight conditions, as having a very strong ability to root sucker, stump sucker and root sucker, so I would be a bit concerned about that. I've seen one instance where Ailanthus in a woodlot was cut for firewood. This is Mike Grayson's woodlot, and it did not. It was a closed canopy above the Ailanthus, and there was limited resprouting. So I don't think the root suckering happens in all instances, but does happen in some instances. Okay, we talked about Emily's integrated vegetation technique and Janine's question about using the ash. Brent's asking about black birch. I didn't. Early on, I did a pilot study that involved 2 or 3 black birch. I don't recall how they responded. My guess is that they would respond similarly to the striped maple, or maybe respond better than the striped maple. So they might have better mortality with black birch. Certainly, if you wanted to use, I think flame weeding would have a lot of application for situations where you have trees that are 4 to 6 inches in diameter, 3 to 6 inches in diameter, and you're wanting to do essentially a timber stand improvement or a crop tree release. You could use flame weeding as the technique to girdle the tree, because you wouldn't be really worried about whether or not those sprouted. So you might have a red oak or a black cherry or a sugar maple or whatever is your crop tree, and then 1, 2, or 3 or more undesirable stems around those, the flame weeding would be an option to a chainsaw girdle or a hack and squirt girdle. Okay. Art asks about efficacy in rhododendron. No idea. I haven't worked with rhododendron art. It's one of the differences between that and the species I've worked with. It tends to have evergreen foliage. I don't know if that would carry over to having some type of physiological difference or not. I can't say. Marcia is asking about around here. Flames, vegetable garden, blighted tomatoes. Hope it may have destroyed anything that was left. My understanding with the blight, and I'm not a plant pathologist, but with the blight, the late blight that affected much of New York last year, that blight does not hold over on tomatoes. It does hold over on potatoes. Where do you buy the torch head? So if you want to know about buying the torch head, download the sheet here in the file share that says flame weeding equipment and supplies. Okay, Janine, I'm assuming your plants that were infected, you're talking about tomato plants. I'd rather I don't know enough about. I can barely grow tomatoes, much less talk about managing them. So I'll leave that for somebody else. Yep. Pimo mentions the roofers use the torch for heating projects. The link for the CEUs is up there. That's in Chat Pod 3. Spencer, New Hampshire Conservation Commission volunteers cannot use herbicides on public lands. Flame control may be sufficient method than others in the forest to others in the forest community on privately owned lands. That's a good point, Spencer. When I was working with the Genesee County Parks, the park manager, superintendent, Paul Arsborn, one of his observations was that he felt better sending his hired work crew, so these were employees, felt better about the safety of them using things like flame torches than having them go out using chainsaws. Now, I've maybe given short attention to the safety concerns. You can do some very serious damage to yourself and to others and to the environment when you're using a torch that throws a flame at 1,500 to 2,000 degrees. You cannot don't disrespect the capacity of the flame torch. And I would say, particularly if you are working with volunteers, spend some time. You as land managers or as preserve managers would want to be comfortable using the equipment and then have a training program for your volunteers. Plumber's torch. Aaron wants to know about a plumber's torch getting similar results. I think flame is flame, and it would have, I'm guessing, similar heat capacities. So I would guess that it would work. They tend to have fairly small tanks. Dan's talking about preheating pipes for welding. So welding supply is another option. Kyle's talking about summer flaming, wants to know if spring treatment was substantially more effective than summer for any species. Spring, I only did comparisons of spring and summer on 2 species, and that was multiflora rose, where flame doesn't work in either situation, and the second was autumn olive, and it was more effective in my research on the summer treatment. So Kyle, I can't effectively answer that. Brian points out you can get different tips that might help spread the flame better. Okay, Emily, yes, this webinar is being recorded, and I will have the recording available as soon as we say goodbye and I click the off button, and I can probably, what I'm going to start doing is sending is answering some of these questions at this. There's a forum that we have. See if I got that right. At this site, forestconnect.info.forum. So I'll be able to immediately post the downlink, the recording of this to that forum, and it'll take a couple of days for me to also get it posted to my website. Okay, Pimo points out that rhododendrons are shallow rooted, so they probably would pull. It'd be fun. Somebody down south or works in areas where there's rhododendron should give it a try. I haven't tried this, and I don't know, Kate, if anyone's tried this with black swallowwort. The viney kinds of species I have low confidence in. Thanks, Helen. All right, so Mike bought the off-the-shelf components locally, so you can, if you have a Harbor Freight locally, or get it online and buy the tank. And this is also, I did the same thing, and I bought an old Army issue backpack and made a frame. And so you can piece together a flame kit, if you will, for much less than the $250 that you spend at forestry suppliers. Now, when I started this project 3 years ago, the kits were running closer to $400. So, you know, with the graded, you know, there's been, I think, an increase in interest, and with 2 places selling them now instead of just one, the competition has increased. So, all right, well, we're at I've got 1:13 on my clock, and I know, folks, it's a beautiful day here, at least in central New York. We have bright sunshine. It's supposed to be 60 degrees. Looks like the questions have waned, and I will be happy to take additional questions. I'll hang out for a few minutes, and we'll continue to record this, but we'll just consider this a wrap. So thank you all very much, and I'll look forward to seeing you next month. I think next month we're going to start into our emerald ash borer series of presentations. So see you then. Thanks. Okay, Zeb, good question about permits. I talked to the DEC, and there's a concern about prescribed burning. This is not, flame weeding is not prescribed burning, and it's prescribed burning as a broadcast treatment. It has a different objective than a selective flame treatment. That said, it's never a bad idea to talk to people who might be impacted by something that would happen using flames. I've never used it in urban areas. I would guess that the worry of a ground fire in urban areas is probably not as much of an issue as buried gas lines. I guess personally, I'd rather deal with a ground fire than 1,500 degrees coming into contact with a buried gas line. So by all means, I would check with fire companies or whoever might be appropriate, just to make sure that you're not putting yourself in jeopardy. Okay, thank you all very much. I'm going to turn off the recording and